I really appreciate the invitation. It's really lovely to be here. I am going to use a PowerPoint to present. So I'm going to try to share my screen now. You're going to have to give me a minute to do it. And tell me if what you see is the PowerPoint. Do you see it?
We see yours.
So we're now looking at your email.
Oh, well, that's great. Okay, that's not, well, I'm going to stop the share and start that again. That's so weird. For someone presenting on something technological, it seems not a good thing. If this doesn't work, let's see. I see what you mean. Aha. It's somehow reversed the now you see it, but it's not in slideshow view for some reason. There we go. Okay. Is that correct?
Perfect.
You see the slideshow? Okay. Great. So this is a paper that I have co-authored with Katie Creel, who's a postdoc at Stanford University. And there was we wrote it together in the context in which people asked for people who bring from different disciplines or bring different levels of expertise. And I'll just say right at the outset that the parts of the paper that are the more technical AI systems parts are really the parts that she's most familiar with. And I'm happy to talk about them, but if the questions get too deep into the tech side of it, I might have to punt those. And if you have something you really want answered, you can email me and I'll forward them on to Katie and see what she can do. And I gather you have a draft of the paper, which you may or may not have read. I'll try to hit the main points. So what we're interested in exploring is whether arbitrariness is a problem. So people often say when algorithms make decisions that the problem is that they're arbitrary. Now, obviously, you don't even need to read the slide yet because I'm talking before that. This is one of the problems with PowerPoint presentations. But there are a lot of different kinds of problems that people have with algorithmic decision making. And I don't mean to say that arbitrariness is the main problem. There are actually lots of different problems people have. For example, this is the paper I sent you, right? People are looking confused, right? I did send you this paper. Yeah, okay, good. For example, people might worry about the algorithm not being fair, and they have different complaints about the type of unfairness that might be at issue. They might worry about accountability. They don't know how the algorithm made decisions. They might be worried about whether it's about their access to the information about how it made decisions. They might be worried about privacy. And within the fairness space, you could have a number of different concerns. I've written another paper about a problem I call compounding prior injustice. And that's certainly a concern that people have in worrying about algorithmic decision making. So I don't mean to suggest that the problem that I want to talk about today is the only thing that people care about in the context of algorithms or the main thing that people care about, but it is something that is raised and something that we're interested in exploring. And that's what if an algorithm kind of misclassifies or mischaracterizes a particular person? Like you would really be someone who would repay the loan and be a good loan, be a good lender, but the borrower, excuse me, but the lender says, no, we're not making a loan to you, or you would really be a good employee or employee, but the employer doesn't hire you. So there's a kind of arbitrariness in the way that the algorithm makes decisions. And we want to know, is that arbitrariness a moral problem? And if so, what kind of a moral problem is it? So the setup that we're thinking about is situations in which there are a lot of applicants, if you will, and therefore a lot of information and a limited amount of time. So the two contexts I'm going to focus on today are hiring and lending. So there are tons of applicants for a job. The the employer has to choose which ones to pursue, which ones to invite in for an interview or something like that. So, and has a limited amount of time, and therefore might use an algorithm to help that employer decide which employees to pursue further, or in the lending context, which lenders to borrowers to offer a loan. So we're talking about situations like that. The other aspect of the situation that I want to highlight is in some contexts, there might be some particular reason that relates to the context in which the person who's being assessed has a kind of a right to an accurate or reasonably accurate decision. So you might think of the criminal justice context as a context like that. Before we throw you in jail, we better have a very good reason for doing so. And so maybe we need to be really sure that you committed the offense before we throw you into jail. There's a reason for kind of non-arbitrariness that comes from the context at issue, rather than from a general requirement that there be non-arbitrary decision making. So we want to focus on contexts in which at least it's not clear that there's some general obligation to for non-arbitrary decision making. So we're putting aside contexts like criminal justice, where this demand for non-arbitrariness might come from something about the situation. And we're not assuming that there's no general requirement of non-arbitrariness in the employment and lending situation. We're just starting from situations in which it's not clear that there is, and asking, in those contexts, is there a problem with arbitrary decision making? Now, just to set up the problem, there are, in these contexts, hiring and lending, that we're looking at, there are these automated systems that are used. And what's interesting about the automated systems is that they're used across a broad range of employers or lenders, let's say. So to focus on the employer situation, it might be the case that there are lots of different small employers, but they're all using the same screening tool. In the employment context, one popular one is called HireVue, that's used by a lot of employers. So we're also interested in arbitrariness, what we call arbitrariness at scale. That is, it's not just individual employers that act in arbitrary ways, but that arbitrariness the same arbitrariness might be used by many employers in many contexts. So you might say, look, arbitrariness, that's an old problem. Like when I go to hire someone to be my research assistant, maybe I have weird idiosyncratic things that I'm looking for, and so I make arbitrary hiring decisions in that context. If that's the case, it's likely that my neighbor, my colleague who's got the office next door, he might also be using some weird arbitrary criteria that don't track being a good research assistant, but they're probably different than the ones that I'm using. And so we're also interested in asking, well, is there something different that happens when the arbitrariness that's always been involved in individual hiring and lending decisions gets scaled up, if you will? And the fact that these systems are the same, say, hiring tool like HireVue is used by lots and lots of employers, does that raise special moral problems that aren't present when individuals are doing things? So this is just about it's an ad for HireVue, which is one of the main tools that's used. So I want to, I don't really want to say anything particular about that slide. That's a nice slide. But I also want to, this slideshow, I'm sorry if it's not exactly tracking what I want to say. It's because I don't have my notes popped up there. I want to also distinguish the problem that we're focused on when I say we're interested in arbitrariness from other kinds of problems that you might think of as, you know, race discrimination or sex discrimination. So when we say we're interested in looking at the problem of arbitrariness, let's go back to the individual case, not the one that's scaled up via a tool like HireVue. If I am looking to hire a research assistant and I don't want to hire anybody who's a racial minority, let's say, that's obviously race discrimination, but that's not and you could describe that as arbitrary also, but in addition to being arbitrary, it's also you know, race discrimination, and has whatever problems you think the problems of race discrimination involve. We want to also put aside those kinds of contexts. That is, we're interested in looking at whether decision-making that is arbitrary, and I'm going to go on to unpack what that might mean in a minute, if that's morally problematic, even when it's not decision-making based on any kind of standardly prohibited grounds like race, sex, sexual orientation, disability, religion, etc. Okay, so we're not interested in exploring that. Those are obviously interesting problems, and you know, many people have written about them, but we're saying we're interested in when decision making is arbitrary but not one of those things, is it also morally problematic, and if so, why? And if it's problematic, is it problematic? If it's problematic, is it problematic even when it's just some random individual? And if that's not problematic, does something change when it goes to scale? So now I've just outlined the kind of the issue we're focused on. So this just captures that, what I think I have just said. When is decision making on arbitrary grounds acceptable, or when is it not acceptable? Does scale matter to the moral significance of arbitrariness? And we're interested in cases where no other right, like in the criminal justice context, provides a guarantee for non-arbitrary decision-making. In such a context, is it of moral concern? So the outline of the talk is I'm going to try to talk about what is the problem, why is it likely to arise, why is it a moral problem, and what is to be done about it. Okay. Now, I think I've said a little bit about this already. That is, when is this problem likely to arise? That the arbitrariness at scale is likely to arise when companies use the same tool to make decisions in several contexts, or even if they're not using the same tool, like HireVue, for example, if they're using different tools, but the tools are trained on the same data set, they also could have the same problems embedded within them. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Actually, okay, I'm going to go back to that other slide. I should have rearranged these slides a little bit. So I want to talk about individual arbitrariness first. That is, is arbitrariness a problem without the scale problem, just when an individual is subject to a decision that is arbitrary. Now I'm putting into scare quotes because what I want to do first is unpack what we might mean by arbitrary. When we're saying is not it's race discrimination, it's sex discrimination, we're saying something other than that, what might our complaint be when we say that the decision was arbitrary? So one possibility is that what we're complaining about is a lack of predictability, that I had no way of knowing what factors you were going to use to decide, and that's problematic because I have an interest in being able to plan my life, and I can't plan my life if I don't know what is going to make a difference to whether I get the job or get the loan. And it's surely true that people have an interest in being able to plan. I can understand that. But it's hard to see how they have an entitlement to that the employer or the lender decide in ways that allow them to plan. After all, the employer or the lender could decide, let's take the employer, for instance, first. I used to want people who were speedy widget makers, but now I realize that actually having a cheerful disposition is helpful because you get along with other people on the shop floor. And so now I'm going to choose speedy and cheerful widget makers, which is going to be a different a different group of people. I mean, if you were focused on just being speedy and you weren't worried about your personality, and now you're not going to get the job because I've decided I care about cheerfulness too, it's hard to see how you have a complaint because I've changed my criteria. It's my factory. I can decide what I want to do with it, and I can decide what's good for me to pursue. How is it that you have a complaint based on lack of predictability? So what about arbitrariness? Sometimes by arbitrariness, we mean kind of a lack of constraint, that an arbitrariness is just, there's nothing guiding the decision, lack of constraint by ex ante rules or standards. Well, this is hard to see how this could be the nature of the complaint in the context of algorithmic decision making, because algorithms are rule-like things that decide who ought to get the job. That is, what an algorithm is the rule that's embedded within the decision procedure. So whatever's happening there, it's not unrule-like. And so if people are saying when they get a decision from an algorithm that it's arbitrary, it's unlikely that that is the nature of what they're complaining. I think this one gets closer to what it is that they're complaining. That is, you don't have a good reason for rejecting me for the loan or for the job. Arbitrariness as a lack of a good reason. So this seems more promising, but of course we have to then unpack in a little bit more detail what we mean by a good reason. That's obviously somewhat amorphous. So a good reason I unpack in kind of three different ways, and you could think of them as tiers of demandingness. So perhaps when if you say the decision was arbitrary, you mean that the reason isn't a good reason in the sense that it's not a public-oriented reason. So one that would be non-arbitrary would look like this. So this is in the context of lending. Yes, you didn't get the loan, but that's because if loans were given to people with your qualifications or everyone with your qualifications, there would be so many defaults on loans that the housing market would collapse, and that would be bad for everyone. Okay, it doesn't have to be that drastic, but that's obviously a public-oriented reason, and that would satisfy the good reason requirement. So maybe what someone is saying when they're saying the decision was arbitrary, they're saying that the lender didn't have a reason of that form, of that kind. Well, that seems to us to be too demanding. Why would we think that companies, lenders, or employers have to make decisions about whom to hire that are supported by that kind of a public-oriented reason? You'd need to have some other rationale for thinking that the employer or the lender had such an obligation. And so if we're trying to explore whether they have an obligation to be non-arbitrary, it seems that you'd need to add more to justify the claim that they have an obligation to be non-arbitrary, if by non-arbitrary you mean supported by a public-oriented reason. So what about the idea that a non-arbitrary reason is a reason that relates to the good of the applicant? So a non-arbitrary reason on this understanding would look like this. If we gave you the loan, you would be likely to default, and that would ultimately not be good for you. You would have ruined your credit and set back your ability to attain the sort of financial stability you seek. If the decision was supported by that kind of a reason, it would be non-arbitrary on this understanding. That too seems to us to be overly demanding, in that for a similar reason, it's hard to see how an employer or a lender has an obligation to be constrained to act in the interests of the applicants rather than its own interests. Surely it has some constraints on its ability to pursue its own interests, but it's a pretty demanding idea to think that it always has to act in the interests of the people seeking jobs or loans or what have you. So we then settle on this, which seems, I think, more plausible or more promising. That is that the reason provided must be good for the actor or the decision maker, him or herself. So that a non-arbitrary decision or a non-arbitrary algorithm would be one that was consistent with the employer or lender's own goals. So I didn't give you the loan because I'm unlikely to make a profit by giving you a loan, and I want to make money in this business. So when we say that the decision was arbitrary, we're probably saying something along those lines, like, I actually would be a good risk for you, and you're not hiring me anyway. And so that's what makes it arbitrary. That is, you're not pursuing your own ends, and that's what I'm complaining about. So again, we started with the individual context, and we've been unpacking what it might mean to say that a decision is arbitrary. And we're left with the demand that the actor pursue his or her goals in a manner that's best suited to the attainment of those goals. And what's interesting about this is it seems mysterious why the recipient has an entitlement that the lender or the business pursue its own goals in a sensible way. That is, if the lender wants to be kind of silly or irrational or dumb, I don't know what you want to say, about its own goals, why is that something that is wrong to you? Let's see, for private actors asserting a right to non-arbitrary decisions we're left with the idea that there's no other, let's skip this slide. That just repeats sort of what I said, but less well. So I want to go one level deeper into this idea of what it is that you're saying when you're saying it's arbitrary. You could be saying either what we said a moment ago, like you're not pursuing your own goals in a sensible way, which I'm calling lack of instrumental rationality, or you could be saying there's no reason at all for what you're doing. Like it's not that it's a bad reason, it's just that there's no reason. And I want to go a little further into this no reason at all idea, because it's hard to get your hands around what it might mean. So one sense of what it might mean, it takes us back to instrumental rationality. So we're just on that idea again. And the other unpacking of no reason at all makes it more like a lottery. And I want to try to show you those two ideas through these two examples I call house seller and mortgage lender. And these are in the paper. But in house seller, imagine someone is selling a house and they have their asking price of what they want for the house, and someone comes along and offers to buy their house at the asking price, and the seller thinks to him or herself, well, I don't know, I'm going to flip a coin, and if it's heads, I'm going to accept the offer. If it's tails, I'm not going to accept the offer. So that looks like it's kind of no reason at all. And what seems so, and it seems obviously arbitrary. And what I want to say about a situation that has that form is we can bring that back to the idea of instrumental rationality, a lack of instrumental rationality, in that the decision procedure is I'm going to flip a coin, and flipping a coin isn't a very good way of ascertaining whether this is the decision one ought to take. And so I'm not pursuing my own goal very efficiently if the way I go about pursuing it is I decide to flip a coin at the moment of decision. And so that understanding of what's going on is really the same complaint we surfaced already, which is this lack of instrumental rationality. Alternatively, and this is my mortgage lender idea. Imagine I am a lender and I have a certain pot of money I can allocate for loans, and more people apply for them than I have money to allocate. And so I decide, and they're all reasonably qualified. And so I decide to have a kind of lottery procedure to see who gets them. Now, in some ways, it's similar to what the house seller did. You know, I'm spinning a wheel versus flipping a coin, but there's an underlying reason that I'm employing the lottery procedure, or at least plausibly or potentially. That is, well, given these people are all sort of reasonably qualified, I'll kind of use a fair procedure for seeing who gets it among these people. And so that's why I'm spinning the wheel. There, it's not that I lack instrumental rationality because the people are all reasonably qualified. It's that I have another goal, which is kind of, or maybe some are slightly more qualified, but I don't care about that. And I want to have a fair distribution of these resources. So I have another aim, which is to distribute them fairly as I perceive it. So sometimes kind of a lottery is our paradigmatic case of a fair distribution in many instances. So failure to use a decision rational instrument to achieving my goal, if my goal is to make money, could be what we mean by arbitrariness, could be one sense of arbitrariness. But when I'm departing from that because I'm pursuing another goal, which is fairness through a lottery, we wouldn't describe it as lack of instrumental rationality. We describe it as pursuing some other goal, which is fairness, and then maybe it's a kind of arbitrariness, but it's not the kind of arbitrariness that's being complained of. Okay, so where does this leave us? Essentially, the borrower or the prospective employee is asserting, you have a duty to others affected by your actions to do what seems reasonably likely to be good for you. And what we want to say about that is, it's hard to see how there's such a duty. That is, having unpacked arbitrariness, we think the complaint of arbitrariness and the kinds of contexts we're looking at, we think the best understanding of what arbitrariness is a complaint of lack of instrumental rationality on behalf of the employer or the lender. And if that's what it is, how could one think that the other party has a right that the lender or the borrower the lender or the employer do what's good for the good for itself? And so it's we conclude that there is no such obligation, and thus that their arbitrariness in the individual context is not of moral concern. So that's the end of the first part, that individual arbitrariness is not of moral concern. The second, I'm going to skip this part because I just looking at the time. The second part of the paper, so we also then consider, is there something to the idea of treating like cases alike, and conclude that there's nothing more added to that. So the second part then looks at, well, what happens when we go to scale? Is there something different happening when arbitrariness happens at scale? And as I said a moment ago, and I'm just going to switch back to one slide I skipped, which was the one that's kind of showing you how arbitrariness happens at scale. I just love this slide anyway, called the IMAGENET problem. That is, IMAGENET is a algorithmic tool that's trained on a huge number of images. And in fact, you might think it's going to have less irrationalities in it because it's pretty cheap to have the data input to on which the algorithm can learn which images are which. But because the backgrounds, the way that the algorithm works is backgrounds are so important, and because of that, it misclassifies lots of images. Like the squirrel is misclassified as a sea lion because of the smooth black that makes it look like it's water, and the dragonfly is mischaracterized as a manhole cover because manhole covers, is that what you call them in England? I don't know the things that are on the street that you lift up and then you can go down and work on the pipes and the sewage underneath the street. We call those manhole covers. They have a lot of pattern in them. And so there are lots of ways in which algorithmic tools can contain the kind of silly irrationalities, if you will, that individuals can also have in their own decision making. But the difference is when we go to scale, they're going to apply across a wide range of cases. Okay, when that happens, is there something different going on? So who is the algorithmic Job is what this slide is called. Well, one thing you might worry about is that it might not be some random group of people, but rather the kind of people that are excluded arbitrarily, that is in a way that doesn't serve the employer or the lender's own interests, might actually overlap with legally protected groups like racial minorities, women, religious minorities, etc. So there might be a random group of people. It might not be a random group of people. There might be a disparate impact or an overlap with a legally protected group. And that could be the case for sure. What we want to say about that is when that happens, arbitrariness matters, but not kind of in itself. Rather, if the algorithmic tool has a disparate impact on a legally protected group like a racial minority, then most legal systems require that there be a kind of legitimate business reason for use of the tool that produces the disparate impact. And if the tool is arbitrary, that is, it's not a good way for the employer to achieve its own ends, then the arbitrariness matters because it negates the justification that the employer might have for producing the disparate impact on the legally protected group. So in that case, arbitrariness matters, but kind of indirectly because it negates the justification. But that's only in the context where the group that is excluded overlaps with a legally protected group. What about the context in which there's no overlap with a legally protected group? There, the random group of people who are excluded are only a group to the extent that they're numerous and they're the same people across a run of settings. Now, they may not be the same people across like that are excluded from the irrational tool or the not great tool used in employment and the one used in lending. So maybe that's a little too strong to say, but if the same tool is used by many, many employers like HireVue, then they're going to be excluded from lots and lots and lots of jobs. So that's what we mean by across a run of settings. So there's a group excluded, they're a group only not in the sense that they share anything important, they're not a socially salient group, but they're a group only to the extent that they're excluded from broad range of opportunities in the employment context or in the lending context. They could be anyone, and we'll leave that. Okay, so why is that a problem? And here we want to say it's a problem in a way that's similar to why monopolies are a problem. That is, why are monopolies a problem? They limit opportunity in ways that are morally troubling. And this is kind of the inverse of that. That is, it matters that people cannot get kind of, if I am a low-skilled worker who's always applying for jobs where the employer is using HireVue, and I can't get any of those jobs because I'm always being screened out by the hiring tool, that seems to constrain my opportunity sufficiently or to cross a threshold to which my opportunity is constrained in a way that's morally troubling. Now you might be thinking, well, that's true whether the tool is arbitrary or non-arbitrary. That is, people who lack relevant skills are also systematically excluded from a range of opportunities, and that's morally troubling also. So what's problematic is not in a way anything to do with the arbitrariness. It's to do with the constraint on opportunity that systematicity brings, whether the systematicity is supported by instrumental rationality for the employer or the lender or not. And we would agree with that, that the problem with systemic arbitrariness is its systematicity, not its arbitrariness. But, caveat, the arbitrariness matters, though only in a small way, in the same indirect way that it did in the disparate impact context. That is, if what's a problem is, morally speaking, when people are shut out of broad ranges of opportunities, that's a problem whether the screening mechanism is arbitrary or non-arbitrary. But when it's non-arbitrary, there's some business justification for it. And when it's arbitrary, then it lacks that justification. So systematicity is generally problematic because it constrains opportunity. It's somewhat, you'd say, weakly justified when it's non-arbitrary, and that weak justification is lacking when it's arbitrary. But because we identify systematicity as the problem rather than the arbitrariness that's a problem, because we say the lack of the non-arbitrariness is only a weak justification, we're actually interested in technical solutions that address systematicity rather than arbitrariness. And basically, this is the part that I'm not going to go into in detail, our technical solution is to introduce randomization. And just as I said earlier, that like a choice for randomization is a way to instantiate some conception of fairness, we're going to kind of pick up that thread and say, it would be a good thing for employers or lenders to introduce some randomization in their selection procedures. Now, we can't ask them to do things that are, bad for them, like they want to choose the best employees and the best risks for loans. But the difference between the best and the slightly less best is often extremely small. And so what we want to do is suggest that over some threshold of what's the employer or the lender needs to have, good employees and to be making loans that are good, over some threshold that way, to randomize among the possible ways to choose the best people to offer loans to, or the best employees to seek, so that different people are randomly excluded either each time you run it or by different lenders or different employers who are using it, so that no individual is kind of shut out completely, so long as they've passed some threshold of being a reasonable risk or a reasonable employee. And the details of that are explained in the paper. So that is basically, I'll end there and stop sharing my screen. And I hope that was clear enough. And I am delighted to take your questions.